Hello, my name is Daniel Greenberg, and I'm the founder and CEO of Earth Deeds. And I'm excited to share this deeper overview of how Earth Deeds supports local solutions to global warming through onsetting carbon emissions and contributing to meaningful sustainability projects. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'll start with some background for how this idea came about. Then I'll compare carbon offsetting to our new system of carbon onsetting. And finally, I'll show you some case studies to give you a sense of how we might be able to help you. And I'd like to start with a story. So, back in 2010, a friend had recently returned from the UN climate change conference that took place in Copenhagen, and I wanted to go hear her give a public talk about her experiences there. And logistics were such that I needed to take my then 9-year-old daughter Simone, who did not want to go to another boring lecture. So I bribed her and said that she could play games on my iPod at the talk. So Simone played Angry Birds while I listened to my friend talk about all the latest scientific research and dire predictions about climate disruption. From glacial melt, which now looks like it'll result in at least a 10-foot rise in sea level by the end of the century, to extreme weather events that could lead to millions, possibly hundreds of millions of environmental refugees, to mass extinctions at a level we haven't seen in 60 million years, to widespread and massive droughts like we're now seeing in California, and also how our window of opportunity to minimize these crises is rapidly shrinking. And to quote Dr. Sylvia Earle, the noted oceanographer, what we do or fail to do in the next 10 years will have a magnified impact on the next 10,000 years. This is the moment. And my friend also spoke about the dire lack of political leadership and will to really make a difference, and the rising tide of public protests and demonstrations. So, on our way home, which incidentally was by way of motorbike to where we were living in India at the time, Simone was hugging me from behind, and she asked me, she said, "Daddy, was all that true? What that lady said about the floods and the famine and the storms? Is that really going to happen?" And I realized that not only had she been listening, but it had sunk in, and she was scared. And I immediately got this lump in my throat, and I thought, well, what do I tell her? I don't want to lie, but I also don't want to scare her anymore. So I took a deep breath and I said, look, it is true that because of how humans have treated each other and the planet, the coming decades may be challenging and uncomfortable, but how we respond to these challenges is completely up to us. And if we keep being mean and greedy, things will only get worse. But I also believe that this crisis is an opportunity for us humans to finally grow up and learn how to treat each other and our planet with respect and kindness. And if we learn that, then I believe that this could be the beginning of the best and most amazing time in human history. And this belief is really the inspiration behind everything I do in this life. And it was also the reason my family was in India, because my wife and I were directing a study abroad program on sustainable community development in an eco-village called Oroville in the south of India, where thousands of people from all over the world brought 14 square kilometers of barren landscape back to life by planting millions of trees and striving to create, as they call it, a city the earth needs. And it was a real privilege to introduce these emerging adults to this incredible community and witness them wake up to new possibilities for themselves and for the planet. And this program was part of a nonprofit called Living Roots, which I started in 1999. And Living Roots partnered with UMass Amherst to take college students to eco-villages around the world. And in the end, over 1,500 students went on these programs, and most came away really inspired to live in greater harmony with each other and the planet. And it was wonderful, life-changing work. And there was a problem. Here was this organization fully committed to sustainability, but we were also flying students all over the world, which was obviously emitting megatons of carbon dioxide. And I felt strongly that we needed to account for these impacts because, fundamentally, we're facing climate change and other environmental crises precisely because, as a species, we've taken nature for granted and we're not accounting for our impacts. Let me put it this way. Imagine you're a contestant on The Price is Right. If I asked you the price of this car or shower stall or a flight to Seattle, I bet you could come up with a reasonable estimate and perhaps win fabulous prizes. But If I asked you how much carbon pollution is emitted by driving this car, or taking a shower, or flying to Seattle, most of us don't have a clue. And, we weren't born knowing the price of things. I mean, we grew up in cultures where we learned the language of economics, but not the language of ecology. So, to help our students get a clue and really build a vocabulary around their environmental impacts, I set up a system where they measure the carbon footprints of their travel, reduce these footprints wherever they could, and then we priced that carbon. And I'll speak about pricing carbon a bit more in a few minutes, but at that time, there was no good guidance. And so we used the average in what's called the voluntary carbon market, which was around $15 a metric ton. And we just pulled it out of tuition. So each program had a fund to acknowledge and account for the emissions of that program. Well, then the question comes, well, what do you do with that money? And it would have been quick and easy to give it to any one of 100 carbon offsetters. And you've probably heard of a number of them. And so how does offsetting work? Well, it's clear that most things that we do emit carbon pollution, from driving a car, flying a plane, using electricity, etc. And the idea is that you can pay a certain amount to one of these offsetters, and they will reinvest this money into a project such as efficiency, renewable energy, reforestation, etc. And the claim is that through your money, they will reduce the same amount of carbon emissions from entering the atmosphere and then give you a nice certificate so you can say that you're now carbon neutral. You've mitigated or neutralized your emissions. And to their credit, they've helped a lot of people better understand their emissions. And since 2005, over $3 billion have been transacted to support a lot of good projects around the world. And I mean, so far, they're really the only option for doing something about your unavoidable emissions after you've reduced all that you can. But there's also a lot of challenges with the system. So I'd like to go through a couple of them now. A big one is that to be able to sell these credits on the VCM, they have to be verified. And there's all these other middlemen. And it's often as little as 30 cents on a dollar that actually makes it to the projects. They've also been compared to 16th century indulgences, where parishioners could pay the church to absolve them of their sins. And so many people say offsetting is similar and is allowing people just to buy a clean conscience while delaying meaningful action. And pricing carbon via market forces has a number of challenges. One, the market's volatile. I mean, the price goes up and down. For example, the prices plummeted a few years ago when there was an oversupply in the European market. But, I mean, really, what relation does that have to the real impact of these emissions? And there's also perverse incentives. So imagine I'm an offsetting company and you're a project holder. Say you're planting trees. Well, I mean, it's to my interest to pay you as little as possible to buy the right to claim the mitigation value of your project. And really, I mean, shouldn't we incentivize the system so you get as much money as possible? And their supply is limited. I mean, if by some miracle we all decided to offset our emissions, we'd quickly run out of projects to support because as a species, we're just not neutral. And really, is it enough to be carbon neutral when the world clearly isn't? I mean, is that really the highest bar we want to set? And another big issue with offsetting is what's called additionality. And this means to be valid, carbon offset projects can't result from business as usual. They have to have happened because of their access to VCM funding. Another example, imagine you paid me some money to plant some trees, okay? And I plant those trees. But then you find out that, hey, you know what? I was going to plant those trees anyway. Well, you might be a little upset. And the truth is, it's very difficult to know when a project is in fact additional. And some estimate that as many as 70% of projects would have happened anyway, even without offset funding, in which case they're not really offsetting anything. And also, because of all the middlemen, offsetters typically are confined to working with very large projects because they need an economy of scale so that they can make a profit when they sell the credits on the market. And these projects tend to be at a great distance from the consumer. And so they don't really usually have much meaning or significance to the people or organizations buying them. Okay, so for all these reasons, I thought, well, I don't want to offset to acknowledge the emissions from our flights. And I struggled with this for a number of years. And then finally, it dawned on me. What if we create a whole new system? We could call it onsetting, right? And it would look a lot like offsetting in that we would still measure our emissions, we'd still reduce our emissions, and we'd still price our unavoidable emissions, although in a different way. I'll get to in a minute. But if we just drop this problematic concept of carbon neutrality, suddenly we gain a lot of advantages and opportunities. So, for example, without having to pay these middlemen, we can get a lot more money to the projects themselves. And rather than guilty indulgences, we can have a pay it forward story, a positive story, where we can say, hey, look, let's be grateful for all that fossil fuels have enabled us to do as a civilization. And let's reduce carbon pollution wherever possible. And let's recognize that there's this externalized cost in burning these fuels. So let's internalize these costs and then pay it forward and support projects that we know are doing good work in the world. And rather than price carbon based on market forces, we believe we should price carbon based on the best scientific evidence of what it's actually costing society through emitting carbon dioxide. And the best estimate we found is called the social cost of carbon. And it came out of the Obama administration in 2010. Obama set up 12 agencies, the EPA, the DOE, 10 others, and working with the best scientific data around, they came up with their estimate of the actual cost of emissions through sea level rise, disease rates, extreme weather events, declining agriculture. I mean, all these things have costs, right? And okay, of course, there are things that are difficult or impossible to cost. I mean, how do you put a price tag on the extinction of a species? But given these constraints, they came up with their best estimate, and it's currently $39 a metric ton. And this will go up each year because they're going to model this better. And of course, the longer we delay, the more likely it is that the damages will be worse. And then, rather than worry if our money is actually getting to projects, Onsetting says, let's get our money to projects that we already know and trust. Small projects, local projects that we might not otherwise be able to support. And it was really this last idea that catalyzed my thinking with regards to Living Roots. I mean, why would we give money to some anonymous project when there were all these great projects right in front of us in these eco-villages that were aligned with our organizational mission? And so that's what we did. We put our money towards projects in the local communities we were visiting. And we supported solar cookers in Senegal, electric rickshaws in India, a recycling center in Mexico, a dormitory in Israel, if you get the joke. Students lived in this. And tree planting wherever they went. And it worked really well. The students loved it. It was a way for them to give back to their host communities. The communities obviously loved the support. And it was a way for Living Roots to develop relationships with these host communities. And it wasn't always easy, collecting the emissions data, selecting the projects, dispersing and tracking the funding. I mean, to be honest, it was often a pain in the butt. And for about a decade, I kept wishing that someone would just set this up as an organization, as a turnkey solution to help me and others that know that we can't wait for governments and corporations to fix things, and that we all need to step up and do something about our emissions. But the only available option of offsetting doesn't really feel good. And finally, I got tired of waiting, and in 2012, I left Living Roots to start Earth Deeds. So Earth Deeds is really helping organizations understand and manage their carbon emissions, and then support sustainability projects that have meaning to them. And just to be clear, I absolutely believe that we need to reduce our carbon emissions as quickly and as fully as possible. You get no argument from me on that. What we're saying is we need to do that, and we need to do so much more. We need to create local and resilient food systems. We need to preserve biodiversity and wildness. We need to fight for climate justice and for those unfairly burdened by the consequences of global warming. And we need to deconstruct and replace the economic and political systems and even the mindsets and worldviews that got us into this situation in the first place. You can't do any of that through offsetting, but you can through onsetting. Here's another way to think about it. I mean, our best case scenario is to keep warming to 2 degrees centigrade, which will be hard and will still result in major crises that we'll have to respond and adapt to. But we do have a lot of ways to reduce our carbon emissions, including offsetting even in some cases. The problem is that there's a larger cost to our unavoidable emissions today. So let's start onsetting our emissions now and use this green tax to support reduction efforts and beyond. We need to think systemically and focus on living in harmony with each other and the planet, below Earth's carrying capacity and above a social equity baseline. And certainly, climate change is the 800-pound gorilla in the room, but there are other environmental crises that we also need to address. And we also need to build the social foundation and equity necessary to create safe, just, and resilient communities and ecosystems. Let's go for the gold and really help make the world that we want for ourselves, our children, and all life. Okay, so this is our current site. You can go there and watch a 5-minute overview video if you like. You can learn how it works for all kinds of groups. Our first pilot was with a sustainable living class that I co-taught at UMass a couple years ago. And about 80 students measured their percentage of the university's footprint and their related travel emissions. And we exceeded our target of around $830-something and gave close to $900 to a student group raising environmental awareness on campus. And interestingly, not all the students contributed personally, but they also used social media to attract others to this project and crowdfund additional support. And that's where a lot of the funding came from. And we'll never know how much carbon dioxide these funds kept out of the atmosphere. I mean, these students weren't trying to be carbon neutral. They became carbon conscious by internalizing the social cost of their emissions and then paying it forward, passing on the torch, as it were, to other students teaching about all the environmental issues that they were learning in class. Another example, a study abroad program decided to onset their travel emissions and support a renewable energy project that they visit in Nicaragua. And so using an Earthdeeds custom calculator, students entered their flights and ground travel. For example, a round-trip flight from Miami to Costa Rica and a bit of driving emits about a ton of CO2. And as a side note, we also have a more detailed calculator that keeps track of participants' full itineraries. Either way, users can then see equivalencies of their emissions to help build their carbon vocabulary. So, for example, did you know that a ton of CO2 is about the average annual emissions of someone living in El Salvador, or someone watching over 11,000 hours of TV? And then finally, users are encouraged to voluntarily contribute towards their selected project. And in this case, the organization split the cost with the students to recognize their shared responsibilities. I mean, yeah, it was the students that were on those flights emitting the CO2, but they were doing that because the program existed. And then Earthdeeds retains a fulfillment fee, which of course then enables us to further develop these tools and resources and help you and others become even more carbon conscious. So Earthdeeds is free for organizations to set up and use, and you can think of us as one of the sustainability projects that you're supporting. PLU decided to onset the emissions for all their students studying abroad, and a student committee decided that the first year funding will supported ecological retrofits of their global education building on campus, and in future years funding will go to sustainability projects in their students' host communities. And CIS Abroad is doing this now and supporting meaningful projects in 14 of their host countries that host their study abroad programs. And we're now talking with UMass about also working with international students coming to campus to onset their emissions and support a sustainability innovation fund that's specifically available to these students. And other schools are interested in asking their faculty, staff, and students to onset their commuting and support campus sustainability initiatives. Lots of ways to do it. And one final example, we're also talking with the Sustainability Conference, ASHI, about inviting their participants to onset their accommodations and travel to the event, and then capitalize a climate leadership award that would be submitted by and voted on by the participants themselves. Okay, so just to recap some of the benefits, we think Earthdeeds really helps groups and organizations walk their talk and be the change that they wish to see in the world by supporting local, meaningful, even non-mitigating projects that they're connected to, and building the carbon consciousness of their constituents, possibly creating new funding sources, all while avoiding the inefficiencies and controversies of the carbon market, and generating a lot of great stories and positive PR. Of course, the big story is that global warming is likely the greatest threat humans have ever faced, and it's unfolding in our lifetimes. We need to work together. We can't afford to be passive bystanders, hoping someone else will fix things. Earth Deed's big solution is empowering the millions of small, local solutions, people and projects working now to create sustainable communities and a healthy planet. What groups and events are you involved with? What projects do you love and want to support? Let's put them together and catalyze a global carbon consciousness. So when my daughters become adults, they and all of humanity can say, we've finally grown up. Thank you.